Pakistan still falls under the fragility index that is prepared by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. It actually started escalating the conflict between two rival groups. So the evaluators had to stop it. No accountability measure should supersede the safety and security of people and should not cause any kind of harm. We initiated this Pakistan Evaluation Association. And now we have over 100 members. We have a youth wing. We call it Eval Youth Pakistan. So DAC criteria, जो कि English में है, we are translating it in Urdu. दिले उस शाख पर ये वाकया तहरीर होना है, वो सूरत चांद है लेकिन उसे तस्खीर होना है.
Assalamu alaikum viewers. Today we are introducing another newly published book titled Evaluations in Context of Fragility, Conflict and Violence. And we have invited the author of the book, Mr. Hur Hassnain, to enlighten the development professionals seeking new ideas and approaches while designing and conducting evaluations. Hur Hassnain is a development professional from Pakistan, currently based in Belgium. He's working with one of the Directorate General of the European Commission as Senior Advisor Evaluation, and also he's an elected board member of IDEAS. He is also the founder of Pakistan Evaluation Association. Assalamu alaikum, Hur. We welcome you to our show, Baat Se Baat.
वालेकुम अस्सलाम बिलाल साहिब, and बहुत शुक्रिया आपका. Thank you very much for inviting me on Baat Se Baat. It has always been a great pleasure listening to you and your honorable guests, and आज मेरी खुशनसीबी है कि मैं यहाँ पे हूँ.
Firstly, I would like you to introduce yourself, your work and your organization to our viewers.
I am an evaluation professional. It's just been over 18 years, and currently I work for one of the DGs of the European Commission in terms of like providing support in the international partnership and cooperation in terms of the evaluation of development programs. But it has been a long journey, and actually my first internship was at the Strengthening Participatory Organization, जहाँ पे Bilal साहब, you were the head of the monitoring and evaluation unit or department. तो आपने ऐसा inspire किया कि see I'm in the profession today, and it's such an honor कि जो आपके mentor हैं वो आपको बुलाए. So I mean it has been 18 years, and जिसमें मैंने I've always been very experimental throughout my life. So I've done many things. So जो development का जो organizations का एक cycle है, मतलब started from the civil society organization, then I did a lot of projects and work with different governments. I mean, my recent job was with British Council based in London in their headquarters, which is like a non-departmental British government organization. And then the commission के साथ and also I served for I worked with the UN, one of the UN agencies. तो ये तरह से cycle मैंने complete किया कि donors, governments and civil society किस तरह से evaluation को देखते हैं. So that is me.
Yeah, that's great. So what are the focus areas of your book, and how does it guide to the project management professionals in effectively planning, monitoring and evaluating a development project in a challenging context?
The book is all about understanding the context. And it is very, very relevant to contexts like Pakistan because it is a very evolving context. And then also Pakistan still falls under the fragility index that is prepared by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. Um, so, I mean, the context is very evolving, and which means that specifically in terms of evaluation, context should be the most important thing. A designer of the evaluation, a manager of the evaluation, and the person who does the evaluation should take care of. But this in a practical world, as I mean, you have much more experience than I have, is very rare to see. I mean, there is a bit of a gap in terms of the people who design the interventions, people who design the evaluation, and what is happening in the context, which are hundreds of miles away from where they are actually based. And I mean, having this opportunity of working outside Pakistan, seeing things from out of the box, I got this opportunity to understand there is this gap. I mean, and I mean, there is this mentality of this donor organization or donor countries, and then the recipient countries. And I mean, we have seen there are so many examples of things going wrong in development programming, and more specifically in the humanitarian side of things. That it was kind of a campaign that we launched at one of the evaluation conferences in Guanajuato, Mexico in 2017, where a group of like-minded evaluators, including Michael Bamberger, who's doing a lot of research, is from the USA. He's doing a lot of research on big data and evaluation and etc. So that a discussion generated from there, and then we created a group that was specifically thinking on like, okay, there is a difficult context, and the context is rapidly changing, and how would you do the evaluation now? I mean, I would just give you a few examples. It was 2016, I think, we started doing a baseline survey. I mean, baseline survey is, at the start of the project, you gather data on, the indicators of change on the targets, etc., that you established to start with. But then if the context is moving and the population is moving, then that data that you collect at the beginning of the project for comparison purposes do not remain valid. I mean, for example, अगर एक population आज इधर है और आप उसको 2 साल बाद उसका change measure करना चाहते हैं, and then they move on after next year, I mean, you don't have anybody to get data from. So that was one example. Also, when Afghani refugees were sent back to Afghanistan from Pakistan, there was also we started gathering data at the camp they gathered in at the first place, for, I mean, immediate humanitarian response and etc. And I think we were doing that with START network, which is a network that is established for like quick funding. But then again, it was a moving context. People had their relatives. कुछ दिन वो रहे वहाँ पर setting में, but then as soon as they found a relative in their villages or like somewhere else in Afghanistan, they just moved on. So, like, as evaluation is very much dependent on a counterfactual. I don't know what is the Urdu of counterfactual. It's like something to compare with. So either you take your baseline values and then you compare it over a period of time, like, we call it like time series analysis, or you establish kind of a counterfactual by identifying comparison groups or control groups. I mean, it's more pharmaceutical term. So you identify like if there is one Hur Hassnain who would be the person, like the could be the replica of Hur Hassnain, and then we can compare them over a period of time. In short, the book is all about the context. अगर आपने research करनी है, आपने evaluation करनी है, and if the context is evolving, it is moving, so how would you go about it? And I think we were very lucky. No, I mean, that's not a very right term to say lucky, because the pandemic arrived at the time when we concluded the book, which means all the remote evaluation methods and techniques that could also be used for research, or actually that is being used for research anyways. They were very valid, because the context we were talking about was fragility and conflict affected context. But then due to the pandemic, access to the beneficiaries became difficult. So the whole world actually became kind of fragile. So that's actually
Yeah.
mainly about the book.
The parameters you have presented in the book to conduct evaluations in a fragile context and hostile environment, do you think it's compliant with DAC criteria, the OECD's?
Okay, so until last year, there were at the moment there are 6 DAC criteria, and we are lucky to have 6. But until last year, they were 5 DAC criteria, and I mean, for people who don't know, I would like name them. It starts with effectiveness, efficiency, sustainability, relevance, and impact. Until last year, we were doing a huge campaign that was actually derived by the humanitarian side of the spectrum, because that was the 5 DAC criteria were very much focused on the developmental aspects of change, rather than the humanitarian side of the things, where things evolve very quickly. So we managed to push, and there was also a conference that was held in Thessaloniki in Greece, in I think that was 2018, where I also participated, and then we led the big campaign about it. So we managed to put coherence in it. So coherence, I think that goes very well with the discussions we have in contexts like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and in other contexts which are fragile as well. But then again, it's very tricky, because I mean, when you have to talk about a change being coherent to something, or an intervention being coherent, for example, where there are like different regimes, like say, like I mean, in past a few years ago, like in Syria, there were like 2 3 different regimes working. Like, I mean, there were like a pro-Assad regime and anti-Assad regime. There was ISIS, and etc. So how would you identify like coherent with whose policies, whose strategies, and etc.? And I think same applies in terms of defining change and everything. But what we have done is, in the book, of course, we have laid all these differences there, and then also in a context that is fragile, that is changing. You may not have time to evaluate all the 6 criteria. So in such situations, I mean, the book talks about that you can then rather choose the one that is more important to you, and then you go with that one, because I mean, evaluations are of course time consuming. They're also resource that is required to conduct an evaluation. So prioritization is the main message in the book.
So, don't you think that maintaining this register can help in making projects successful, and the evaluation should focus on how smartly this register has been maintained over the period of project implementation?
Indeed, that is very important. And if you have to, and I think that is very relevant for the fragile context. I mean, if there is a risk register, and then you look at it, and then you identify your strategies accordingly, or the alternative strategies accordingly, then I mean, that's, and I think that's very good for the monitoring side of the things. And similarly for the evaluation, I mean, if that register is maintained there. So that will help you understand the context better. That means you would not do a mistake. For example, it could be like, I mean, there is a famous example from Pakistan in Swat Valley when some evaluators gathered people for a focus group discussion for an evaluation, and then it didn't go well. I mean, people, it actually started escalating the conflict between two rival groups, so the evaluators had to stop it. But then there are so many other examples where things went wrong. I mean, of course, as evaluator, your objective is to like sit with people, gather the data, analyze it, so that course correction could be made, programs could be adapted accordingly, and that actually maintaining a risk register goes very well with what I said earlier about understanding the context. अगर आप context को understand कर रहे हैं, if you know what the conflict is, if you understand what could trigger violence, if you understand what the gender norms and behaviors are expected, then I mean your evaluation would cause less harm. I mean, there's also an example. I remember, like, we hired an evaluator to do a short evaluation in Zatari camp in Jordan with the Syrian refugees. And the evaluator, as evaluator, we kind of like probe, okay, so what happened? What did you see? And the evaluator was interviewing a 13-year-old young girl who actually had experience, seeing people coming out of a burning library, like burning people. So like with a bit of a probing, the little girl started crying and she ran away. So just imagine like evaluator interviewing a victim of sexual violence or like a physical harassment or physical violence and etc. So yes, at one point there is your job, and at one side is the ethics around things. No accountability measure should supersede the safety and security of people and should not cause any kind of harm. Just to add to that, I mean, nowadays, people interview or do the surveys with very fancy mobile phones and tablets and etc. And then sometime I have actually seen in my book, there is a photo as well, in evaluators taking like armed guards with them. That is also questionable, because I mean that could, if there are militias and etc. operating in that area, so that could kind of trigger some sort of alertness, like, okay, what is happening here? Not everybody understand what an evaluation is and what we are doing there. So that could also cause harm to the people being evaluated, and also the local people who we hire to collect data.
What is the concept of value for money? How does it relate to your book that talks about programming and evaluation in fragile context?
Okay, so this is also, I mean, I mean, when you ask question, I find myself very lucky because I have historically been engaged in these decisions. I mean, so when, for example, first of all, when value for money was introduced, I think around like a few years ago, they came up with like 3 E's of the value for money, like economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. But then there was the question of equity there. For example, a toilet dedicated to disabled people would always be expensive than a toilet for the whole public. So I would say like these fragile contexts, the conflict affected contexts, are always expensive because, as you mentioned, the risk register earlier, the security that is required to make sure everything moves safely, and also like the things that you need to get things moving are all a bit expensive. So these settings are always expensive. So if you are going towards like a traditional cost per beneficiary, then the cost here would always be higher. So I remember when we had, we pushed to add the fourth E around equity, talking about like these difficult contexts, people with like, with disabilities, or actually if you say remote areas. I mean, if you are, for example, doing a project in a very accessible location in Islamabad compared to one that you do in like one of the tribal areas, I mean, or like in Gilgit Baltistan, there will be some cost difference. um, we have certainly discussed these concepts and philosophies in our book, because I mean, I think it is definitely important for any evaluator to know, as well as the designers and the commissioners of evaluation for projects, for policies, big programs.
You are also the founder of Pakistan Evaluation Association. Please share its background, scope, and the programs in Pakistan.
I mean, thank you for asking this question, Bilal Saib. This Pakistan Evaluation Association, it's an initiative that we took about like 4 years ago. It's 2017 is when we started it. And that was basically, I mean, I realized that there was very little participation, or equal to none participation from Pakistan in the international forums of evaluation. So for a few years, I kept going internationally, like, I mean, to international conferences, and then I was the only Pakistani. While in comparison from other countries, there were like many different people. I mean, more specifically, India. I mean, India produced a lot of very good evaluators, and they were there sharing the evidence, and that how that evidence influenced the policy, like the policies that they were making. It was so good to hear that the actually policy making was based on some kind of evidence generated. I mean, 3IE, one of the leading evaluation body, is actually headquartered in New Delhi. So they have like more movement, but I mean, more than India. I mean, many other parts of the world. I mean, but then only Pakistan was behind. So that was something I discussed with a few colleagues of mine, and we initiated this Pakistan Evaluation Association. And now we have over 100 members. We have a youth wing. We call it Eval Youth Pakistan. Unfortunately, I'm just out of the youth wing now. So, but I mean, still, I get to talk to them, which is good. And together with the young people, and the overall PIA members, we do a lot of webinars. We deliver some lectures in which we invited some international evaluators to come and speak to our students. Like, for example, we did twice in Contexts University. In 2019, we organized a Pakistan Evaluation Conference, which I think, as far as I know, is the one and only evaluation conference that happened in Pakistan by a voluntary organization. So we did it at PIDE, the Pakistan Institute for Development Economics. I mean, of course, in partnership with them. And then again, we had like people from the government, from the UN agencies, the World Bank, and of course the civil society. I mean, civil society is very active in Pakistan. And then we also invited international speakers who, of course, using online platforms like Zoom, talk to us. Now, at the moment, I mean, I'm very actually proud to say, because you had a question on DAC criteria. So DAC criteria, जो कि English में है, We are translating it in Urdu, and Pakistan
Great.
Evaluation Association, of course, with the the Planning Commission of Pakistan, evaluators from there, from the evaluators from the UN bodies and from the civil society or private sector, हमने एक working group बनाया, and we are translating it into Urdu. Hopefully, it'll be launched very, very soon. Beside that, we also did a survey on indigenous evaluation in Pakistan. That should also be launched by the end of the year. So there are some activities going on. So stay tuned. We have a website, pakistanivaluation.org. We also have Facebook page and Twitter. So yeah, now please do follow us, because it kind of encourages all the volunteers that are striving to promote accountability and transparency in Pakistan.
I know you do poetry in Urdu, and your first poetry book, Mohabbat Jeet Jati Hai, published in 2006. In your current routine, do you still have time to continue with it?
Okay, so that's a very difficult question. I mean, I am still a poet by heart, but then that poet nowadays develop theories of change and log frames and etc., which actually the log frame is very similar to like the kind of classical poetry that I do in Urdu, because it has a frame, it has a 4 by 4 matrix. You have to be very, particular in terms of the indicators, the word that you choose in there. But I mean, to be very frank, I don't find much time to do poetry nowadays, because I write poetry mainly at night. I mean, so I have to be awake all night to complete a poem, because जब एक ख्याल आपके जहन में होता है तो it kind of bothers you, or like push you to actually write it down. So yeah, I mean, I read a very classical poet, so that's my style. um, so it's a bit tricky, but I would definitely come back to poetry. Yeah.
Would you like to recite your poetry for our viewers?
Geez, Zarur, why not? It'll be a pleasure. It was actually one of my ghazals that I wrote actually, I think maybe just before or after I was at SPO. I think maybe just before. So you might have already heard it. but चूंकि आपको देख रहा हूँ तो मुझे वही जहन में आ रही है आज. वो कुछ इस तरह से थी कि दिले उशाक पर वो वाकया तहरीर होना है. दिले उशाक पर ये वाकया तहरीर होना है. वो सूरत चांद है लेकिन उसे तस्खीर होना है. और जिसे तारों भरी रातों में अक्सर सोचता हूँ मैं, मेरे उस ख्वाब को शर्मिंदाए ताबीर होना है. और गजल लिखूं मैं उसके नाम पर इकबाल की लय में, सुखन को मेरे गालिब और रंगे मीर होना है. और वो खुशबू जो सितारों से जजीरों की हदों तक है, मेरे जज्बों की सूरत में उसे तामीर होना है. और अभी तितली की है परवाज फूलों पर, मुझे एक दिन फिजाए बेकरार में उड़ के आलमगीर होना है. मैं हुर हूँ लश्करे ईमान में पहचान है मेरी. मैं हुर हूँ लश्करे ईमान में पहचान है मेरी. मेरा होना गुलामे हजरत शब्बीर होना है. दिले उशाक पर ये वाकया तहरीर होना है. वो सूरत चांद है लेकिन उसे तस्खीर होना.
Wow, बहुत good, बहुत good. I used to ask two questions from all guests, and I would like to ask the same from you. Which book are you currently reading, and what will you recommend to our viewers to read?
Okay, so I am actually rereading a book. I think it's the third time I'm reading this book. It's called Sapiens, by somebody called Yuval Noah Harari. I don't know if it's the right pronunciation of the name, but it's very famous. I read it twice in its like text form. And since now I live in Belgium, they are known for their comic arts. A lot of comics, followers, if you have some viewers who are comic followers, are actually from Belgium. So they created this comic version of this book, Sapiens. So I'm nowadays reading this one. So it's very interesting. It's about the human history, like how the humans were actually evolved, how they are, like you and me today. We are thousands of miles away from each other, but then we're using this technology to interact, which will be then shared with a lot of your followers, and the way we will interact and etc. तो ये कैसे सिलसिला start हुआ, and the guy has used a lot of different kinds of science, like from anthropology, from history, from that genetic science, the DNAs and etc. And then उन सबको combine करके he presented a very beautiful book. And actually, I mean, there is a series as well. There is another Homo Deus, and then a new book he launched was like 21 Lessons for 21st Century. But Sapiens is literally a mine, a gold mine.
So you have traveled to many countries and places. Tell us the place you like most and want to travel to again and again.
Ji, bilkul. I have been to 46 countries so far. I really wanted to do 50 countries a couple of years ago, but then Corona came and I couldn't move. So stop lag gaya. To, but inshallah, next year I would like to do my 50 countries. Majority of them were like for work purposes, and I think I'm very lucky to do that. I think if I think about I think one country is very difficult, so I'll say two. I've always been a big fan of Jordan. It's very rich in culture, in history, and then I'm specifically coming from Pakistan. I mean, we have a lot of references to quote. I mean, you go to Petra, and you see, that's like one of the wonders of the world. There you see the Roman traces there. You go to Wadi Rum, and this Dead Sea where you float as human. And then on the other side, I love Mexico and Latin America. I mean, I think Latin America as a whole, but then Mexico specifically has this very beautiful and very powerful culture that literally drives you. I mean, everywhere you go, you see people happy, singing, dancing, eating tacos, and very delicious Mexican food. So yeah, I can go to these countries again and again.
Okay, great. Thank you all for joining and sharing valuable information and knowledge with our viewers.
It's a pleasure, Bilal Saab. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I mean, I'm a big follower of your programs as well. So please continue doing this, great voluntary effort that you are. I know how time consuming it is. But yeah, thank you for inviting me.